Geci, here we are. Welcome to Femme Futurist Society, or the conversation series. Really, this was designed because Emma and I were meeting these extraordinary women around the world who were doing this work, and we thought, gosh, it'd be really great if we could have these conversations. And we're having them kind of offline, and we thought it's actually inspiring to hear them. I love learning about the work that you are doing and others are doing, and the way that you're framing things, and the way that you're helping others make sense of all the change that's coming toward us and what we can impact as we start to imagine what we want the world to look like moving forward. So thank you for joining us in this conversation. And the arc of it is that we learn a little bit about how you got to where you are and the place that you're in right now, the work that you're really passionate about, and then how you're expressing that, so that we can all kind of catch up with you on your thinking and where you would like us to be focusing or championing some of the work that you're doing. So sound good?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Where are you videoing in from? What city are you in now?
Right. So I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa.
And how long have you been in Joburg?
Ooh, wow. Okay. That's an easy question. Probably the last 15 years or so, in South Africa for the past almost 2 decades now.
Yeah. So take us a little bit, actually, instead of your career journey, which I think will be interesting in a moment, but take us through your physical journey. You grew up where?
And So born in Nairobi, Kenya, in East Africa. And then at the end of high school, moved to Iowa in the US to go to college, and went to a small liberal arts college there. After that, went as quickly as I could to warmer climate, to California, ended up in Los Angeles, went to UCLA, and then worked in LA for a few years. Met my now partner and moved to South Africa, and we've been here since.
Wow. See, that's what I think is so interesting, again, when you start talking, because your specialty, what you really focus on, the sort of the places that we will live and how we live. And so I think it's always fascinating to see your journey. So to imagine going from Kenya to Iowa must have been quite an extraordinary thing at age 18. How did you...
I wasn't even 18, so but almost. Yeah, it was extraordinary. The most extraordinary thing was, I mean, there were many extraordinary things, but the one I remember and liked the least was the change in weather. When you grow up on an equatorial sort of country and climate, you kind of get used to the weather being more or less the same all the time. And I guess we're all getting used, even in Kenya, to that not being the case anymore. Right. But going from that to the extremes of real winters and real summers, I knew the words, but I certainly didn't know what they meant until I went there. And I really hated that. I couldn't leave fast enough, not because I didn't like the place, but the weather was brutal.
Well, it becomes a really interesting determinant, right? When we decided to move to Austin, because I've been in Austin now for 12, almost 13 years. And I had been in LA for 13 years prior to that, and then Chicago and New York, and I grew up in Atlanta. I was born in Europe. And when we made the consideration to move to Austin, it was very weather was definitely one of the key 9 criteria, right? Close to an airport, cost of living, mindset and all that stuff, but weather was really it. And because I'm with you. I'd rather be in 100-degree weather than be in 10-degree weather. And we all have our preferences.
Absolutely.
Although unfortunately, to your point, we're getting all the extremes at this point. So that is sort of the fascinating thing. And so your work currently focuses, I think the way you describe it is the intersection between people and place and technology, and focused on the Global South. So is the Global South a well-known definition? Do people understand when you say Global South, what the breadth of that geography is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's maybe a bit of a academic/political definition, but yeah, I guess it's what people used to refer to as the developing world, or third world. There had been over various times different terms we used to describe this. But yeah, the Global South, at least in our context, become sort of an acceptable and an understood clarifier for basically places that are mainly in the Southern Hemisphere, but also perhaps are at a different place in terms of the usual development trajectory thinking.
So, but so specifically for you, that goes from South America, Central America, through Africa, through Southeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a fascinating thing, because again, I think that we probably so understand, is that a word? We have a lack of understanding of really the advances that are happening in this portion of the world, and the opportunities and the challenges that exist across that breadth. So I think it's a fascinating conversation to jump into your work, but we will just start with a bit of background. Again, what I always think is fascinating is to see people's academic or curiosity journeys, even less than the actual jobs, but to go from comp sci to sociology to architecture to urban planning. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
Which I think, again, if you talk to youth, I just was watching one of your interviews, and you're at the end of it, you were talking about what you say to youth, and you've got a teenage daughter. I've got 3 young adults, like teenage to early 20s. And it is really fascinating for them to realize that what you study at this moment in time, between ages, 17 to 21 is not the defining end all be all of what it is that you will do. Although it does, I think, speak to the innate curiosities that you have that will probably lead you to the work that you continue to do. But I think it's fascinating that you bring, again, that constellation of curiosities. So you do understand the technology, you certainly understand the sociological impacts of these things, and their relationship to place, and specifically to urban centers. So you are uniquely qualified to have this conversation about where it is that we're going to live and how we're going to live moving forward. I just think it's a really interesting thing when you start to imagine the confluence and the shifts of all this.
Yeah. Well, to ask questions rather than to answer them, right? So that's I think always the thing. And I don't know. I wish it was all as deliberate as you make it sound. It was really a journey. It was really doing something and then realizing, oh, but hang on, maybe I'm not completely satisfied with that, and then taking on the next bit, and then walking across the street and finding something else, and then getting into that. So yeah, in hindsight, I always say to people that I don't think my academic journey would make sense to anybody, even though you just made it sound very good. But in hindsight, it's what I needed to do when I was doing it, and it has led to where I am now, and I'm really enjoying the explorations I'm doing with that sort of mishmash background.
Yeah, but it's funny because I think of it really seriously, much less as a mishmash background, but the fact that you have this unique, unique, I don't know what the word is, perspective set with which it is that you get to go and have these conversations. Because I think that I talk a lot about that curiosity is as unique as our fingerprints, right? What you're curious about is different than what I'm curious about. And so the fact that you have this way of being able to I don't know the words again, approach something from all these different places of learning. If you were going to get another degree right now, like if you just at this moment there's something you want to go study, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't.
Fair enough.
I always say to people, my God, after the doctoral work in particular, it was brutal. I don't think I'd ever wish that upon myself again. If I did, it would probably be in some creative field, to be honest. I don't think it would be in anything technical. My PhD work was planning and evolutionary economics. And so that was my foray sort of into that. And yeah, I'd probably either go into something really in the design kind of field, so that in that direction, or maybe physics. I've always loved physics, but almost for the same reason, that I think there's a creativity in it that I really enjoy.
Fascinating. That's so interesting. And so for me, I think it's interesting because there are these sort of ways of describing our learning that didn't exist when I was growing up, like behavioral economics. If I'd known that behavioral economics existed, I probably would have gone more in that direction. Instead, I kind of tried to cobble my own version of that together with psychology and economics, but I didn't quite get there. And I do think and at one point it is interesting because I thought about going back to school a few years ago, thinking, yeah, you know what, I'm sort of, I hate to say stuck in Austin, but at that point I was feeling a little like restless and wanted to take on something more. And I started looking at academia going, you know what? They are not keeping pace with all the things that it is that we get to learn out in the real world. You and I are both part of Singularity University's expert faculty. And when you get to spend time with these people who are literally architecting and building the future, you realize that actually, I think that to be unfortunate that academia is just so far behind in these conversations. Like, I don't know how you feel about that, but even as I was going through the college searches with my children, and I'm like looking at what it is that they're being offered, what it is that I know that my friends are building out here, I was having a hard time sort of connecting the dots in real time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think for me, well, first of all, it's a sector that really has to, and I think it realizes that even pre-COVID, that higher ed really needs a rethink and a retooling. but in addition to that, I think for some time now, and maybe it was the liberal arts background, I think I realized that, look, the institutions are offering what they can. I have to figure out what I need. And so, and in part, I think I was lucky that I didn't get caught up in the education system we had in Kenya, which is much more fashioned after the English one, so much less flexible. I did appreciate the US sort of setup where you could, change majors every day if you wanted. You could cobble things together. You could do things. I mean, there was work that went with it, but the fact that you just could be that creative. I mean, this mix of degrees you just read off, that wouldn't happen here. That would be almost impossible to do here. But the US system sort of allows that. And maybe that's the future, is that I think the university needs to be a place for learning, and what the degree is called and these disciplines that they're so precious about, I've never been precious about. I don't really care about.
And I think you're 100% right. And unfortunately, I think the US has moved less so. Like, I think that kids are now asked to figure out their majors at age 17, and they don't know. Like, I didn't declare mine until I was older. And so, and then when you apply to a school, you can't switch over if you're in a big university. So I think you're absolutely right. I think part of what the issue that's happening in higher ed right now is that they've calcified to a place that was actually, they didn't keep up and keep pace. Because I think students do want that flexibility. They do have multiple curiosities. We're encouraging them to have it. We know that the future needs and expects them to have that. And so that to me is one of the exciting things about the moment that we're in. It comes with a lot of pain and a lot of tragedy for many, but I do think this is the wake-up call for higher ed to think about how it can actually meet the needs and the demands, which are much more versatile. And we need people with all those unique curiosities. We don't need to think, a zillion people that are just at home only studied accounting or have only studied law or have only studied chemistry. You really need that breadth across those things. So anyway, as you start to think about the future, so I, have been writing and thinking a lot about the fact that we're in this new moment. I describe it as the fourth productivity revolution as opposed to industrial revolution. I think there's a whole different way in which we're thinking about how productivity is created. Certainly in a digital world, to use an industrial term is dumb. But as you start to imagine, as we went through these big shifts, it really did change how we lived and where we lived, right? As we were separated from agriculture and able to then move into towns and then into cities and then into eventually, suburbs, as the automobile came along, and other technologies did change and shift the way and we work and where we lived, right? So you start to imagine that on the horizon, as you start to look further out, as we start, and we'll talk about, the smart cities and the terms and all the ways in which people can reimagine that. But if you really let your imagination go out as far as it does, with so much more, perspective and wisdom than the rest of us have, what do you really imagine that life could look like? I don't know if it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now, as we decouple our work and our place and the way that we live.
Yeah, I think when I look out, and partly what I've occupied myself in is, in fact, less the study of cities as they are, because I've spent many years doing that, and beginning to wonder what makes the difference. And for me, as I think that far out, what excites me is less trying to imagine where we will be, than wondering what are the things that would undo some of the staleness and mess that I feel we're in right now. So I'm involved in communities like the Emergence Network, which is really asking a whole different set of questions. It's like an exploration into the otherwise, the idea that there are other ways of being. And if Africa, not Africa as a landmass, but maybe as a heuristic for the fact that we occlude so much, there's so much that's it's not in our textbooks. You said earlier that people in the US maybe don't know as much about the Global South. The Global South doesn't know about the Global South because we're just not part of knowledge. We're just not part of the story. And so when you talk about 20 years from now, I imagine a 20 years from now where there are many more influences and voices and considerations and rituals and practices that we don't even have or imagine now. So I really feel and crave for a more diverse future, and not just in colors of people, that's not so important, but in possibility. I mean, I often say I'd love to go to places from one to the next and feel that they were actually different. I mean, you're an SU faculty like me, so, back in the day before COVID, we traveled a lot. And one of the most painful things for me, besides, the flight miles and the airport time, is just how gray everything becomes after a while. Places appear to be trying to look the same. People are trying to be the same. And I think there's something tragic in that. There's something that's really not resilient, the opposite of what we're all trying to be. That's not sustainable. That's not interesting or exciting. Yeah, so that's when I look over the horizon, I think that's what I crave. It's less so, that world might be worse. Actually, it might not be better, but I think it'd be more interesting than the moment we're in.
I think there's two ways to look at that. So I had my moment like that when I got to travel. When I graduated from college, I got to go travel through the sort of backpackers trip through Europe, and so you hit like a city a day. My mother's from Europe; she was horrified. They were like a day in London and a day in Rome. But as you did that, what you saw was Benetton in every single city. And I was just like, what, wait a second. That was, I think, my first taste of globalization, what can happen with global brands. Like, I just was so unprepared because I'd come from cities that were more distinct, and all of a sudden everything started feeling like I didn't know what city I was in. So I completely agree with you on the idea of identity, right? And Austin actually really prides itself very much on being unique, keep Austin weird. And there's this tension then between progress and bringing in brands, like Lululemon or whoever the brand of the day is into retail centers versus keeping it local, and some of the opportunities and advances around that. So I think that's one way of looking at diversity, is that there's identity. The other thing is the diversity of lifestyle, right? I think that what I really crave is that we will have all kinds of different ways in which people can live, and whether they're in multi-generational homes or they're in community. Like Emma and I was talking about the fact that we're going to someday if we're haven't figured it out any other way, that we're going to have our own little commune with however many fascinating and interesting people, and age that way with multi-generational fun and around us. And so I think that there will be so much more diversity in the way in which we get to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And just imagine what that sort of diversity would mean for so many things that concern us right now. So we're obviously in this really difficult moment where our relationship with the planet is really troubling, but yet again, we're looking for the big same brush strokes for how we address that. But maybe if we were all consuming different things and in different ways and aspiring to differences in lifestyle, like you say, I think perhaps there are many balances we could find. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we are in this planetary imbalance, that rates of depression and suicide, I like talking about that when it comes to cities, are so high. Surely there's something else. And then I do think we occlude a lot in the kind of limited imaginary we tend to allow ourselves for the future. So for me, I think what excites me is inquiries that challenge that, that invite us to expand possibility.
So that's exactly what I would love for us to spend a little time within this conversation, because these are the things that we don't often get to have. People always want to take us back to kind of where we are or how the next 5 steps are. So in this desire for reimagining or really like opening up perspective about what is possible, and I agree with you, I like that the idea of loneliness and depression and suicide are really forefront for me. We knew, again, it was prior to the pandemic that it was happening. I think it's certainly accelerated during, and I do think that there's a lot of contributors to that, but certainly place is part of it. And I think a lot about community. Right. Again, the reason I envision where it is that I might want to live 10 or 20 years from now is because I don't want to be alone as my children are grown, and I may or may not be, partnered up with someone. And so the question is like, how do I ensure that I am part of something greater than me, and I'm connected to something that is more social than just, what we've sort of built thus far. So if we get to imagine, what is it that we are put too many blinders on? Like, what is that sort of look like? For me, it's community. Like, I really do want it to be both sustainable and community centric. What is it for you?
So definitely those two, for sure. I mean, I come from African cultures that are so communal that we don't even know how to be alone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You can't even ever be alone. you can't actually ever really be alone. So almost to a fault. So definitely that. I think happiness, joy. Again, I come from spaces where I've often said to young people as well, that if, for example, you're working and you don't find joy, and it sounds cliche to say, but honestly, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, then why are you doing it? Because for me, I don't want to live a life where I have to separate the official me from the social me, from the conscious me, from the, I don't want to have, Sundays in church and Mondays in the office and evenings on the couch and Saturdays with friends. I want to do all of these things all of the time because they make me happy. So for me, music is part of my life. Art is part of my life. my work is part of my art. I really think that there's again this almost oppressive idea of living that we've all bought into. So I remember when I first came to the States and people would talk about the house and the picket fence and the, 2 cars and a dog and that sort of thing. But our lives are also like that. There are these ideas that you've got to, first of all, go through these life stages and then be all of these things and these ways at these times. And so for me, it's to not worry too much about doing that. I work hard and I know I do. I don't have to work hard from 9 to 5 to prove to you that I'm a hard worker. I work when I need to. I love this, song, work hard, play hard. I really believe that. I think we've got to really play hard, and that needs to be part of what we do and who we are. I think the separation of culture and art from commerce and business, of economy from society, these things don't make sense to me. I've tried to study them for a long time, clearly, trying to make sense of them, and I don't get it. So for me, it would be that. It would be less division, less separation. And I guess the same between people. I'd love it if my community wasn't only my tribe, if we were okay with each other, and we're not. So that would be a great change.
100%. So, again, there's like 7 questions I want to ask you, but when we think about this integration, right, I do think that, again, the way that technology changes work changes the potential for that. Right. So you and I live this sort of self-directed, non-traditional way of working and blending and living, roles that are paid, roles that are unpaid, right? That we find a tremendous amount of satisfaction in being able to express in both ways because we're able to go do that. This is the wish that I have for society overall, right? I'm very satisfied with the way that my life works, and it's very non-traditional. And you sort of stepped off that sort of traditional train 15 years ago and have never looked back. And what you realize actually when you step off that is that there's a whole underground of other people who do it this way too that you didn't realize were there. You're like, oh my God. And there's a lot more infrastructure. And again, as technology makes that possible. But I also even think about the fact, like at one point wanted to, WeWork we knew was going to be a thing 20 years ago. Like whether or not it was going to be branded that way, but we knew there was going to be an international brand or a global brand that was like that. I just knew that. And I do think the same thing's going to happen with community and living. Like the idea that I could live in any city and I could go from place to place and find community, right, through a network of places. And we're starting to see them pop up a little bit, but they're still really nascent. They haven't really, okay. My computer, sorry about that. They are still really nascent, and but I still wish for them, like the idea that I could fly to anywhere or travel to anywhere and suddenly sort of find my community and my group of people. And I'm not in any way anchored to a place someday.
Yeah.
I see that start to shift in the whole like work from home becomes work from anywhere movement. And we know that digital skills will transfer, so I can do remote surgery from somewhere. I can do a remote crane. I can do my work from anywhere. So we're going to have these like so many more freedoms around how it is that we live that I think that becomes a big part of loosening the chains a bit for me. So I
just hope it could happen earlier. Yeah, because I just wish it could happen earlier, and maybe you're right, technology will drive us all there sooner. So this flexibility that you're saying you and I have, the one thing that strikes me often is I have many people say to me, it's actually funny. So I've only been doing this probably for the past few years, maybe 3 years. For the longest time, I was doing the responsible thing and I had a job and I did all of that. And actually, I believed very much in it. I believed that the changes I wanted to contribute to would be driven through large institutions, large public institutions in my case. And that's what I did. I spent, 25 years doing that. But now that I stepped off of that hamster wheel, I have all of these invitations over the past couple of years for coffees and lunches. And what people want to know, and I'm sure you get this too, is how do you do it? And there's almost this sense that, you must have earned it or gotten to a place where you could do it. What's the secret? And maybe that's true. I mean, I don't know if I wasn't somewhat stable, in terms of family and finance, whether I could have done it, I would have taken the risk. But now that I did it, I realized I could have done it a lot earlier. And it's not something you have to earn the right or the privilege or the financial stability, to do, but it could really be a normal thing.
It's an tension. Well, I'll let you finish your point, but yeah, go ahead.
No. So I think it's just that, and so for many young people in contexts like ours, where then everybody's obsessed with unemployment, and they should be. I mean, we've got like literally up to 50% unemployment in places here, so it's a real thing. But I suppose people like us raise the question, what do you mean by unemployment? And perhaps the problem isn't those who aren't employed. Perhaps the problem is that we still have this cookie mold that's telling everybody that they've got to look a certain way in order to be valuable in society.
Right. And so this is, again, I think that the thing that's really exciting when you start to imagine that we could have different ways of even building homes. So part of it is, okay, to have the quality of life, you have to have X amount of money. And the only way to get the X amount of money is to do this sort of, this experience or this expending of energy in this way. So I think the things that are going to shift around that is actually, we might be able to have that quality of life with less money. So if you imagine that we can 3D print a house for significantly less money, if we can have renewable energy, if we can grow food in hydroponic or aeroponic or vertical ways, that we're able to be such more efficient in the distribution of that, and we take out some of the middle people around it, and there's just so many ways we can do it. That I think make it so that we are actually chasing a very different kind of experience. And actually, again, if we live more in communal ways instead of in separate ways, or efficiencies, we become driven around that. So there's a whole different way of being able to envision what it takes to have a good quality of life, right? And then we start to imagine that we get to, there will be a societal scaffolding. If we are in a productivity revolution, which I really do believe that these technologies will allow us to be very productive, but will require less quote unquote traditional work to get there, then how do we distribute that in a way that people all get to have some of these, freedoms? This is a privilege. I'm really clear that I have a privileged life that I've worked hard to build, but at the same time have been afforded to me, right? And it isn't afforded to everyone. And so when we start to think about what are the scaffoldings away or redistributing productivity that make it so that this is possible for more people. And we think again about work not being something that I do inside an institution or just to get paid, but I do because I just want to express what it is that I'm passionate about. I was talking to someone yesterday in an interview with them, and we were talking about the world of autonomous trucking, what happens to the truck driver when the algorithm takes over. And on the one hand, you could say, well, we're relieving that truck driver from this long haul life, and that was probably quite draining and challenging. It would be cool if he or she got to work in their garage and do woodworking or create music or contribute to their community in some way or take classes or whatever it is that they want to go do, but they still didn't have to worry about being fed and having a place to live. That to me would be liberation in a really extraordinary way. I think my big worry is that we haven't bred people to be that self-directed and that curious. They feel, self-worth comes from a definition external, and that if we don't meet that criteria, that somehow we're, letting ourselves and society down. And that's, I think, the root of the fix that I would like to try and address. But that to me would be an ideal future in which, again, people and place and work and value and sustainability, both individually and societally, blend.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talk about the fact that people, when they think about utopia, think it's either Dubai or Wakanda, which I loved. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's so right. That's exactly what we think. But there's another version of this that isn't I think neither of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the problem is that if one pegs it too much as a big social engineering thing, then it becomes complicated, because that truck driver, could do that if they were in an ecosystem that enabled that, right? And that's the challenge, right? Is that they may want to come out or they may be able, or they may be forced to come out of the long trucking and do and be, do or be so many other things. But, if you're in a society that doesn't get that doesn't value that, you use the word value, that doesn't have any livelihood, is, it sounds like, what are you trying to do on a wage bill? What are you trying to do? You have to earn an income. You have to have a job. You have to have employment. Then obviously it's quite tricky, and maybe that's the trouble with the conjuncture we're at. But that is where I think the possibility lies, with, when you have massive disruptions like COVID has been, it just seems to me that if there was anything positive in something as horrible as this, it's just the idea that we finally have to admit to the disruptive time we're in. And because so many of us aren't disrupted, I suppose we don't always appreciate how absolutely strange and painful this world is for so many people. And so, I was actually writing some thoughts earlier, and I was just thinking that, I'll just read what I wrote because it's what I about in the moment.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. The sound has gotten really weird. And Emma just sent us a note asking you, can we just disconnect and then just reconnect again? Because I want to be able to hear what you say really clearly.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah. So out now?
Yeah, I'm just going to hop out and then just go right back to the same link.
Okay, cool.
Emma, should I do that too, you think? Or actually, you stay there. I want to make sure we don't lose the connection. So you stay there, I'll leave and I'll come back.
Yeah, I'm going to stay right here. You sound fine. It was just that she just started dropping up. There's a slight echo on her voice. Were you hearing it at your end?
I know, I saw that too. And I just want to make sure if she reads what she wrote, that I want to make it clear.
Yeah.
I think it looks better without the headphones. I'm not a big fan of the headphones.
I know.
Really distracting, but.
Bring it back in again.
Welcome back.
Is it any better now?
Much better. Great.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, much clearer. Actually, you look clearer too. The whole thing just looks better.
Oh.
So anyway, you were saying that you've been thinking about this and you've been writing.
Yeah. So I was just thinking that you know, in fact, maybe let me a bit of a story. So I'm on a project team right now that's looking at how we can create enabling regulation for the informal economy. So that's a big thing, you might know, in much of the global south. I think it's probably a thing in the US too, but maybe not at the kinds of scales that we have it in places out here. And it's quite interesting that we generally don't have formal systems that have made sense of that have bothered to make sense of that and figure out, so how do we deal with places that have very formal rules, but that have a reality that it could be 50%. In Senegal, it's 80% of your economy that's actually working under very different rules, because there are rules. Informality is not completely messy and you know, without any rules, but we just somehow don't take that up in the formal systems. And so I'm in this project, and so somebody says, okay, we've got to take this in waves. We've got to think about what we do as an emergency for now to address the fact that that's the economy that's supporting a lot of the population right now. And then we've got to have a middle stage where we begin to stabilize, and then we've got to have a place where we really get stable and we have all of the systems back in place. And the question for me is, why are we in such a rush to get to some stability and certainty, where in fact, perhaps what the moment allows us to do is to realize or understand that we need a different set of relationships with reality, relationships with power and control, with the planet, with time, with each other, and that we didn't actually have all of this figured out, and that perhaps the rush is not a rush to certainty, but to a rush to a way of being that is more responsive to the now, and the now changes constantly because it does. And so maybe that's a problem. Maybe it's a problem that, and you know, when people use this language of the new normal, I'm not a big fan of that language, because it talks about settling into a new space. And actually that new space people are thinking about isn't that new. It's sort of got remnants of this dirty past that many of us were trying to deal with. And we want to bake that into a new normal. And I just think that perhaps, and this is why I talk to people now more about the journey than the destination, because I think perhaps that's part of the challenge, is that the obsession with destination is an obsession with certainty and stability and something you can put your finger on. And maybe we need to understand that that's just not possible. It was a pipe dream. It wasn't true. What is true is what we do. And we do a lot of messed up stuff.
100% agree. I think for me, it's about how do we get used to being in a place that's constantly dynamic and have confidence that we can still make decisions. Because I think the opposite of that is that we then just get stuck saying, well, at some point until it gets clear, we don't need to invest in something, or we don't need to build something, or we don't need to create something. And I think it's about being in that place where we can continue to move things forward, if you will, progress and build whatever the solutions are, but do it with a confidence that we don't know exactly what the next step is, or that we sense and respond, right? We stop for a moment and we kind of take stock about where we are and then make a decision more left or more right or more forward or more back. And I don't think we're very good at doing that. But that is, I think, the skill that we're cultivating more and more each day, is confidence.
Good time for it.
I've said now many times, and I can't remember if I've said it 7 times in these interviews, but being a school superintendent in the United States right now would be a really, really challenging job. Like, I can't imagine a harder one, because in real time, you're trying to decide how to meet the needs of so many different stakeholders with so much pressure coming at you from so many different places, and with the option to not continue doesn't exist. Like you can't just close your restaurant down or close your retail store down or decide, that you're going to like live off the, royalties of something else for a while. You have to deliver. And, so everyone's figuring this out in real time. And as we get better at that, I hope that we'll be able to get better at making these kinds of decisions that are non-binary or non-rooted, if you will, right? They feel stable, but they don't feel rooted. There's a difference between feeling like you're not blowing in wind, but that you can feel as though you can make decisions confidently. That's my hope for the capacity that we're building for people. So to get more concrete around some of your thinking so that people get a chance to really understand where, tap your wisdom. I know you're sick of answering this question, but we're going to ask it anyway. When we start talking about smart cities, right, and what we imagine the cities of the future to be, and the multiple definitions around what that could look like for you, the ideal city, a city that is advanced. Let's not use the word smart. Has it's built with what components?
Right. So for me, first and foremost, so there's no city without people. And so any city that isn't cognizant of who it is isn't a smart city. And we have many cities like that right now. So we have many cities that would clearly mark as not smart because they don't take into account the totality of who they are. And so that's who's resident in them, who's passing through them, but also then who gets to make the call and shape them. So one of the stats I often like to give out of UN Habitat was that a few years ago, in just taking Africa, the informal footprint of many cities outpaced the formal footprint. So we have, by and large, a bigger informal, unplanned, what many people might call slums or informal settlements, then you've got the planned part of the city. Now that's really interesting. So what is the city and who's planning it? It's planning itself from what we can see. In the meantime, you've got people like me called planners and architects who believe they're in control, and a mayor who thinks they're in control. So it's got to be first and foremost about the people, and something therefore that reflects the values and the inclusion of those people. Now, smart obviously always has a strong tech element to it, so people always expect that. And I think that's an issue of the times. Probably there was a time where if we didn't have a flint or a round tire, a round wheel, or a fork or something, we might have said that didn't make sense as a city. Well, for now, it doesn't make sense to have a city that doesn't have its administration in order and more or less digitized. It doesn't make sense to have buildings that aren't leveraging whatever tech is possible, that aren't looking at how to move goods using drones and better technology, that aren't. So I almost tend not to talk about the tech because I think that evolves over time. And so there'll always be, if I don't say IoT this year, then I've missed a key point. Next year, it'll be something else. So the list of tech, I think, is absolutely about the time. And so I think a smart city is contemporary and of its time in that sense. I think the smart city is also the one that's geared to, I guess the first point, to the values and the value system of who's in there. So I talked earlier about diversity. I think that's where the diversity kicks in. I often say I'd love to go from one city to the next and have a really different experience of place, both materially and socially and emotionally. And it would be because these are different places. And so if it's a water scarce place, I'd like to kind of notice that I'm in a water scarce place. I lived in LA for many years, and you'd have thought LA was a lush,
totally, yeah,
water secure place. And I shouldn't knock LA because I actually like LA in spite of many things. But it's not a place that was perhaps honest in its water scarcity, and we don't, we had these lush surrounds that really pretended to be something else. So I don't think a smart city does that. A smart city looks like what it is. And celebrates that, and there are ways to do that. So yeah, I often say that for me, the smartest cities are about imaginaries and imaginations that are boundless, but that are contextualized, and that are really inclusive and reflective of where and who they are.
I think the contextualized is a really important part. Like it really does take into consideration that you start first with what the city is or where the city is, to your point, in terms of its literal geography. Palm Springs does feel really different than LA, right? You go to Palm Springs, California, and you feel the sense that it is a water scarce city versus to your point, you're in LA, you don't. So I think that's a really, really fascinating point. But I think it's also about the people. I would think it's Interesting. I always talk about that cities, in my experiences in the United States mostly, are defined often by a single question. Like there's a question that they love to ask that defines that city. So in St. Louis, it's where you went to high school, or in Atlanta, it's like who your parents are, or where your family is from. And in New York, it's what do you do? And in California, it's whether or not you checked out that like cultural thing, or in San Francisco, whether or not you checked out that recent cultural thing or tried that crazy truffle at the blah, blah, blah place. And in Austin, people ask you about what you do and has nothing to do with your work. They want to know who you are as part of your work, but sort of like what do you do? Like, what is your thing? Like, what is the thing that kind of drives, right? Which is part of what I think really defines the city. I think people are very encouraged to have that expression of themselves out in addition to and outside of their work, whether they're musicians or whether they're really interested in fitness or whether they're really interested in doing something for the community or whatever it is. I always found that really fascinating because I was asked that several times when I first moved here, and I was like I didn't know how to answer the question. So I do think that idea of sort of like, people will, I guess the question is, if you have ultimate choice around where it is that you get to live, at some point, if we are able to create this abundance that we sort of believe in, and we think that this, that technology will afford, and this decoupling of having to work in a particular place or even in a particular kind of way, how will we make decisions about where we live? What do you imagine will be the guiding factor? For me, it was about values, right? I wanted to be in a city that sort of believed certain things and was open politically to the left and to the right and to the center, which Austin is. One that really believed in community, which Austin really does. Like I was trying to look for places that I felt like somehow represented me. We'll become more polarized. Like that's actually one of the dangers, right? Is that we become more polarized and we live with people who just think like us.
Yeah. And that's a real risk, the tribal tendencies that we have. I think for me, it will be values driven, and there's and maybe there's nothing wrong if we're in fewer places, because that's part of the challenge, right? We're on a planet that really can't handle the extent of spread that we have. I'm just thinking about the question for myself. How would I choose where to be? And part of that is simple for me. Part of that would be family. So maybe that's partly what would determine where I'd want to be, but possibly how I feel. And so this idea of home, which I don't always think is about family, but places that make you feel, and so for me, I can go to Dakar in Senegal, which I often, I don't often speak about, but I often think about, because there's something about Dakar, and I'm not Senegalese, and I don't even speak French really. I studied it, but I don't speak it. There's something about being in Dakar that really makes me feel, so I could choose to be there. I could choose to be there just because there's something about it. There's something about the culture. There's something about the way of being. There's something about the way I feel about people there. And it's not about the infrastructure or the whatever. I mean, I hope that will get better over time as well. But I do think that it'll come down to values and just that something that you feel about what feels like home.
Right. So I think that, it's funny because I hadn't really thought about this until we just had this conversation, but I do think I worry then all of a sudden, because we talked about Austin has actually one of the largest income segregated cities. And Texas, if you look at the top 10, like Texas, all the cities sort of end up in that list because we've got this land we can spread out, right? So the richer you get, and as we have income, more and more bipolarized income, you've got the richer who continue to move to further communities that are more and more gated away and leaving the rest, which is creating huge issues socially. Because if you aren't going grocery shopping with people across, incomes, and you aren't voting on the same bonds, and you don't have the same city council people, and you don't sort of share the decision-making in a more integrated way, you start to otherize the other people, right? The rich get categorized this way, and the people on the other side of town get categorized the other way. And I think that's super dangerous. Like it's not a healthy situation. So if you imagine that on a global scale, where I can move wherever it is that I want, and we aren't mashed together in cities where we're forced to be together in the same office building or in the same apartment building or on the same street, I actually think that can be really dangerous now that we think about it. Like I worry for that values potentially push us into places where there's a city of all people who just think like this, and another city of people who all think like that.
Yeah, it could be. But I mean, you're talking earlier about tech solutions, and and maybe this is another space. So, I mean, I grew up in Nairobi, Kenya, where I didn't see very many white people. So let's talk about that. And then I moved to Iowa, where I hardly saw another Black person. The funny thing is, although everybody assumed that it was very strange for me to be surrounded by white people, It wasn't, because in a strange way, I'd always been surrounded by white people in media. Every TV show I watched, every magazine I picked up, there were a few local ones, and there are many more local ones now, but back then a lot of it was Western media and Western images. And so perhaps that's more dangerous than who I physically got to be with, because I physically was with certain kinds of people, but there was this hegemonic impression of who shaped the world and who was interesting and whose ideas were worth watching and listening to. So maybe there the question isn't then so much where you live, but what is reflected, because I mean, we are globalized at the end of the day. That's not going to change. I don't think media will go away and we'll only watch local TV, right? So chances are, but if that globalized media continues to be controlled only from certain centers and express only certain content and only certain faces and only certain ideas of what the world is, then I think you're in a real danger of getting into some bubble where you really think that this is the world. So I just wonder whether, again, that diversity of no, I like to think people wouldn't gravitate into
we're losing your sound again. Yeah, you're coming in and out again. Darn it.
Should we drop?
Yeah, let's do it one more time. And then
Sorry,
we'll stop torturing you.
Okay. All right. I'll be out now.
Dang it.
I know. Dang.
Great things. And I'm like, I don't want to cut you off, but I can't hear you.
I know, but it does sound, I mean, that was particularly bad. We'll have to cut that. So it's worth doing. I mean, clearly it's a compression issue on her end, which is a bummer.
Can you let her in?
She's not in yet. Interesting though. I like this idea of advanced cities versus smart cities. So that change in nomenclature says a lot. Anyway, I'm going to let her back in.
Hey, I'm sorry about this. It's not even showing me that my connection is bad, so I'm really not sure what's going wrong.
It's all right. Again, things we can control and things we can't. So at least we haven't been Zoom bombed. Like no one has, shown us a body part that we don't want to see. So we're all good at this moment. But I feel badly cutting you off because I think your stream of consciousness is great when you were saying, do you remember where you left off?
No, maybe just wishful thinking, wondering whether, one has to be careful what we assume about people, but I'd like to assume that people wouldn't just want to be with people like themselves. If there was such possibility, if there was such,
again, I'm living in the United States right now and in Texas, so I'm feeling less hopeful about that. But I wish that, right? And so we were talking again about the reason for urban planning in a certain ways that it includes, when Tony Hsieh was rethinking Las Vegas. I'm not sure how familiar you are with all the work that he was doing there, right? But for him, collisions were really important. The idea that you'd run into someone at a coffee shop, or you'd run into them at the playground, or you'd run into them in a community, kind of restaurant area. It was really important that we had a chance to kind of like bump into people and not be able to A, so isolated, or be so myopic in the way that we worked. Like as you think about the design of cities, and whether or not they're smart or advanced or wise or intelligent, whatever the term is we want them to use. For me, I want them to feel welcoming. Like I want them to be connected. I guess I want connected cities, and for me, connected as broad sense of terminology. Is that something that we need to be spending more time thinking about? Like how do we connect people?
Absolutely. There's so much about the physical environment that's so deliberate and many of us don't speak about, we're not even conscious of. And that's one of the things I've enjoyed about perhaps getting to speak about cities with wider audiences, because I try to get people. So it's amazing, first of all, that until recently, many people haven't really thought about cities, the city they live in, why things look like that, why the bridge is that height. Why there are or aren't these kinds of spaces, why there aren't benches in certain areas, or why, we don't think about these things. But all of these things are designed and they curate life, right? I'm also involved right now with a heritage project. And one of the things I was saying to them is then we also have to be careful, because when we also see places just as architecture, we perhaps miss the point about what isn't there, what wasn't built, and why it wasn't built. And again, this gets into issues of power and capital and choice and inclusion or exclusion. But there's so much that's so deliberate. And so I think cities and in fact our built environments, because they're uniquely human, I mean, they don't come from anywhere else. I mean, we curate these places and they're an amazing heuristic then to me for our brilliance, our success and our innovation, but also our failures and some of the ugliness that we literally embed in physical space. And tech can be the same. I think we can do very much the same things using any other technology and not just the built environment. So I do think that we've got to be a lot more value driven in what it is we're trying to be and a lot more responsible. So earlier when you were saying that people, you know, can feel a sense of, well, I'm not going to make a choice because I'm uncertain about things. I think it's also taking the responsibility for that. And so I think we need consumers that are a lot more responsible. We need capital that's a lot more responsible. And yeah, our cities really reflect or ought to reflect our values. And if they don't, then that's something we need to be conscious of.
I could not agree more. And I think as we round out this conversation, I think this the tension between formal and informal is a really interesting thing. Like we talk about this, the sort of the sprawl or the growth of the city that could be, you know, designed because people are deciding to do it, or economically people are creating these sort of informal businesses. When you imagine again, what I go back to the techno lens. You know, I champion a project called Holochain, which is an evolution of blockchain, which is much more flexible and affordable and energy conscious and all those kinds of things. But what it really does allow for is this idea of an informal, peer-to-peer, agent-centric way of being able to coordinate resources, right? So if you start to imagine that you put that layer on top of what is happening in a favela, or the same kind of mechanism, right, that allows people to just sort of like figure it out and how to become self-reliant, or not just self-reliant, but like interdependent, right? Like what are the systems are to ensure that we get our needs met. And we put this other possibility on it that we'll be able to coordinate that without centralized systems, quite the way that we have done thus far. And whether that is food, whether that is money, whether that is, the other sort of infrastructures that you'd be able to list off quickly that make a city work, that to me gets really exciting, right? This natural tendency that we have to, and maybe that's where the Global South is actually further along than we are, right? This idea of the informal becoming the thing that becomes the distributed. Could actually be kind of exciting when you think about it.
Absolutely, and I'm really excited to hear you speak on that, and maybe I need to incorporate it as an example, because blockchain is one of the tech I like sort of mentioning in a sort of a flippant way, where I say that, you know, if you're going to come into a context like where I live and talk about all of the wonderful things blockchain could do, and then you talk about how it could make help us essentially do the same thing better and more efficiently, then I'm like, yeah, you know, what we're doing isn't working, so doing it better isn't necessarily what I want to do.
Right.
But when you begin to understand that, no, actually the technology allows you to undo what's not working and really rethink it in ways that make much more sense. So let's talk about not how to preserve the current property, you know, sector, but let's talk about how to make it actually work for everybody, and the tech could do that. Then you're having perhaps what seems like a radical and disruptive conversation, but it's the conversation we need to be having. And then I think tech becomes interesting, but often you see that's not the case. And it's got to do with who's having the conversation, who has the capacity and the ability and the power to be making a decision about, well, what tech seems worth investing in and pursuing for context. And often it's not about the informal or trying to see how to, even here where we have such massive informal contexts, often, unfortunately, that's not the conversation.
Well, that's why I think you go back to the more people that can be in the conversation and the inclusion around that. Again, you know, you and I have this a wonderful, I don't know what the word is, but this privilege, I guess, but I traffic across so many different kinds of communities and groups, right? So with corporate leaders, with really on the edge technology developers, with really highly conscious people who are thinking a lot about how to hold people well, with you know, designers and creatives who think a lot more about this expression of what it means to be human. And I get to like be in this place where I get to be fed by all these different kinds of conversations and thinking, right? Which allows me then to kind of like shape mine. And so I do think the more that we can have those kinds of recognize the value of all those conversations in the building of this, right? This is not just the domain of this group over here, and that's the domain of that group over here, but we're getting, and I think that is becoming more and more porous. I definitely think there's much more, certainly interplay. And because it is digital, it doesn't have to be done through formal institutions. We get to do this in our own way, wherever it is our curiosity, leads us. Suddenly we find this community of people who are able to inform our thinking. So that part to me gets very exciting. I think that the part that we never touched on is the scary side of it. Like when we start to imagine cities that are only focused on putting sensors everywhere and privacy, becomes a huge issue as we move forward. Like I think about all the liberating things that technology can do, and mixed with built environments, mixed with community, and mixed with good values or strong people, human-centric values, but it can go the opposite way. Like you take every single one of those things and show you the distorted value of that, or the distorted expression of that. And I do think that's a big part of where you and I get to champion a very thoughtful adoption of these things. And if we build from the center out, then I think we use those things very wisely. If we build from the external in, we're going to do it the long way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, two things, many things are important, but two things that become quite important is, are one, the extent to which these conversations, and maybe I'd call them the enlightened conversations, aren't then a privilege for a few, but become, we have education systems, some of which you and I are both critical about, that we're working very hard to make accessible to everyone. And some of those things are things that I'm still trying to unlearn now. And so we need to be, I think, deliberate as making sure that I think a more critical inquiry is also accessible to everybody, and because those things shape aspiration.
Yeah.
They shape what any kid in a favela or in a township here in Johannesburg thinks is arriving, is aspirational, is growth. And so I think we've got to be quite careful that if we aren't enriching that with anything more than the billboards they're seeing or the box office hit, then to some extent their reality and their aspiration is informed by what they do have access to. And so I think it's just a responsibility around that. And then on the things could be good, things could be bad. Look, I don't know. There are no guarantees, but the one thing I'm sure of is that the wider the space, I think the more likely that the balance will find itself. And I think that's partly the problem, is that we've got such a small space in terms of who calls the shots, who decides what to invest in and what will go and what won't. And the smaller that space is, the less democratized it is, the more certain I am that things could go horribly wrong. I think opening that up, and there are many experiments, by the way, in this regard, even in weird spaces like corruption, that suggest that actually the more open you make it, it doesn't necessarily in absolute terms reduce the amount of corruption, but it reduces its impact, and it increases the oversight, if you want. And so I really do think that we've gotten into this weird thing where we think that a few people controlling things makes it more certain that everything will be okay and that the right choices will be made. Well, I don't know. Many reasons to believe that's not the case.
We're seeing that over and over and over again, right? And I think that's a big lesson of the moment that we're in, the 2020s, that I talk a lot about in terms of reinterpreting risk. Like we built certain things to mitigate risk in the 20th century that we're realizing now are the things that are strangling and creating risk, certainly in the 21st, or that even back then probably made us less secure than we thought it did. And this is the huge opportunity that we have right now, is to rethink that. So what are you working on? So as we close in the last couple of minutes, what are you working on right now that you're really excited about?
Okay, so I'm really, really excited about a project called the Capacity to Decolonize, and it's going to sound really scary, but I've been doing work over the past decade or so, really looking at this idea of decolonizing the future. And that's not a thing that's about colonial Africa only, but it's really a question around what are the things that limit, in a way, the conversation we've been having, that limit possibility into the future, and what would it look like to actually do an action research project that delves right into that and tries to do something different. So what we've done with a team of people from around the world, initially focused in Africa, is to come up with this kind of evolutionary project idea that says, okay, first we need to start by getting people to be quite deliberate and structured in how they think about the future, and that's something you can do. You can get to where people can actually can actually articulate what system they're using for thinking about the future and what they're doing with it. And once they did that, they could actually transform practice in what they're doing in a very sort of reciprocal, reflexive, collective way. So we've chosen 3 themes. One is governance, another is development, the third is education. And we're talking about how do you transform those, working with organizations around the continent. So we've got partners in Tanzania, Mali, Sierra Leone, and then institutions across Southern and Eastern Africa wanting to look at this. And we've planned this huge, ambitious, ridiculously ambitious project that we want to do over the next 5 years that is grounded, but also allows for these things to define themselves as they play out. So it's radical because, first of all, not a lot of funding works that way. So that's going to be the first challenge, is to figure out who on earth is going to fund this crazy idea. We've done our best to package it in ways that don't sound too crazy, but it's quite radical in its proposition that if you want to fund development, then fund development. Don't specify it in terms that are comfortable to you. And I think it's timely, given the uncertainty of COVID. Black Lives Matter and radical inclusion are big issues around the world. I think it might just be the right time for a crazy idea like this, and we're hoping, and then rethinking even research and things like, grant funding for the purpose of doing good. So it allows for technologies to be used differently. It allows for different leadership relations between the funder and the people who are doing things. So that's probably the big one that's really, really exciting me. We've got another one called Reimagining Economy, where we want to combine more traditional R&D with sort of really grassroots hackathons across the continent. And so the idea is to involve everybody in deciding what could be the future of the economy, but then actually to take it through a process to where we're making concrete recommendations. So it's not just, hackathons, some crazy ideas, give a prize, drink the, champagne, and then go back to what we were doing. It's saying, how do we actually play this through? And so that's an idea we've got. And this is with something called the Africa Innovation Summit, and a collective of people around the continent with allies outside as well. And again, these questions of reimagining economy are not unique, obviously, to Africa. I think since the financial crisis, many, many places have done this. I think we've got an interesting take on it. Like I said, that combines that kind of traditional modeling and R&D with this idea that communities and people in very informal, inaccessible places, can also have a say into that, and that it's possible. Technology allows us to do that. It's our choice that we don't. That could be quite exciting. So these are probably 2 of the ones that really excite me. But there's a lot else. There are amazing conversations that are happening in this time that are really inspiring me. This is one of them. I think just the fact that in 2 very different terrains and fields of work, even though there are overlaps between us, that there's so much synergy. I think that's inspiring. That's got to mean something good.
Yeah, no, totally. And I was saying that I think that one of the things that's kept my sanity during the pandemic has been having these conversations, not just because I get to meet new people, because I miss that, but I think you do realize that there's a resonance in all of this thinking, right? There's a core that really, all of our work is so different, and yet at the same time comes from a very similar center and a similar hope and a real belief that this can all happen. And I was actually just thinking it's also about the network. Like, I would love to connect you with Karen Issam, who's a woman who I spoke with a couple of weeks ago on the future of governance. And she's finishing a book about how to rule a world, which is such a fascinating, I love the title of her book. And she's written it with a partner, and they've designed, it's a very open book. It's a very, it'll come out as a book, but it's designed to be a conversation and to involve other people in it. And so she's thinking a lot about the governance piece of it and the role of power. And so she's coming at it from the Netherlands. That's where her work is. And you're doing your work here. And so I just think more cross-pollination of this to see that, these people / women are really leading big, important conversations that I think are going to dramatically shape and reshape, and I think build better, thriving, more flourishing experiences, whether that's cities, whether that's lives, whether that's work, whether that's the way we love, and the way that we get to express who it is that we are. So I get inspired every time we get to have these conversations, Geci. So thank you so much for pushing my thinking. A couple of things just came through in this conversation I hadn't really thought through fully before. So thank you for spending time with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me into the conversations. I was a bit nervous initially. No, you don't get a lot of gendered spaces, oh, are you frozen? Am I frozen?
You're frozen.
Ah, oh, Lord. Okay. Anyway, I'm just interrupting my thank you to say that I was nervous at first about it, but I'm actually coming to believe that there is a different quality of conversation as well that we might have as women, and that there may be real value. And so I'm really glad that you're doing this, and I hope somebody can interview you at the end of this and hear just that reflection, because I'm sure you like me have been in many extremely male environments, and so I wonder whether this journey is showing you anything different.
Oh, 100%. And again, the way that I would say about it is I think it's masculine versus feminine, right? I think that there are men who can have very feminine qualities, and there are women who have been, sort of conditioned to have very masculine points of view on things. And I think what we're really doing is just trying to balance that out on an energetic level. And then on an actual gender level, women are not enough in the conversation, right? So I am totally an egalitarianist. I've been from the very beginning. I have 2 boys and a daughter. Like, I want the world to be fair for everyone, but I'm really worried when we look on the horizon that the people who are building and shaping the future are increasingly distortedly male and masculine in their thinking. So I just want to balance out that conversation and ensure that we have the less bias for sure, and just more perspective on all of it. Like, we're not just only led about the tech, we're not only led about the business model, but we are really thinking about community and people. And that's not the purview of only women, that is a purview of all of us. But it is, I find it really refreshing to have conversations with women in particular. It is really, there is a I don't know what the word is, some people call it a gaze, right? But there's a gaze, or there is a responsibility or something that we're bringing to this work that's really deep and feels really good. So
So I'm glad you're doing it. So
well, you're right. The society is not just people who are interviewed; it's all the people who are in any way interested in this work. So the society is people who are curious about this work. But I do, you are part of our tribe now, and thank you. And I do want to hook you up. Again, I would watch the Karen Ism talk if you've got time. And if you want to meet her, I'm happy to connect you to. And there's another woman in Pretoria, Sahara Shetty, who's doing some really interesting work with youth and helping give perspective on the 21st century skills, but she talks a lot more about the emotional consciousness side of it, the trauma healing piece of it, that's specifically in South Africa. So these are just amazing women that are doing really cool work, and it's fun to weave you all together into this really big web. So
please do.
We will stay in touch. We also are doing a career fair for the future for college and high school kids to help them also reimagine what their work will look like. We had analog versions of it, and then we were trying to figure out how the digital version, but one of them was about the future of cities. We were always looking for who the panelists should be on that. So I now know who to reel in for that one, which I think would be really great. So we'll stay in touch. But again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.